You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
I spent a lot of time working with European companies early on in my career, and then I transitioned to working with African companies later on. When I opened my mouth and I said, I am from Nigeria, the default conversation people wanted to have was about how tough life was and how bad poverty is on the continent and all those kind of typical conversations. If you think to what the actual definition of public relations is, it's about sharing and managing information to shape a particular perspective. There are the minor nuances you have to understand and appreciate because you're dealing with different levels of maturity in terms of the market and also different considerations like that.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find inspirational people who are doing inspirational things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have another special guest. We have Bemi Idowu, who is founder and managing director of Talking Drums Communications, which is a public relations and communications consultancy that supports companies innovating in Africa. Welcome to the podcast, Bemi. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. And I know that you listen to the podcast, so you're probably aware that I like to start from the beginning. So I was hoping you could introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Bemi.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much. So my full name is actually Bemi Idowu, but the reason people call me Bemi is because my family moved to the UK in the early 2000s. Bemi is quite a mouthful, and many people struggled to pronounce the name. So Bemi became like a shortened version of the name.
I understand.
But the interesting thing that then happened is, so I spent a lot of time working with UK, European companies early on in my career. And then I transitioned to working with African companies later on, and particularly Nigerian companies. And then what happened is I carried the Bemi name over, but because Bemi doesn't really mean anything to most Nigerians, it then became a point of confusion. So I went from Europeans not being able to pronounce my Nigerian name to Nigerians not understanding what my anglicized Nigerian name was. So we could spend like the whole conversation talking about all of that.
I'm sure we could. We've had similar experiences.
Yeah. So that's about myself. So founder, managing director of Talking Drum Communications. We work with a wide range of technology companies across the continent, basically helping them to tell their story in a way that works for them in terms of the goals they're trying to achieve. So if you're trying to expand across the continent, if you're trying to acquire businesses, you're trying to get acquired, trying to raise funding, trying to establish a particular reputation around yourself, then that's really what we help companies do and work with a wide range of people. So primarily tech companies, but we also work with manufacturers, industrialists, and generally people innovating across the continent, helping them tell their stories. Because the thing with a lot of these people is that they are brilliant minds, doing a lot of exciting things, but they tend to be very head down in many cases. What we bring into the conversation is this ability to understand what they do and help them tell their story in a way that makes sense for them. So they can focus on innovating, they can focus on building those products and services, and we help them leverage those stories to amplify their presence, their visibility, and drive all kinds of growth that they want to achieve.
Fantastic. So you've given us great insights into who you are and what Talking Drum Communications does as a company. So if we could take a couple of steps back, tell us about your journey and what inspired you to start a public relations and communications company focusing on Africa's innovators.
Interesting question. So the original plan was never to start my own consultancy. I have a few friends that growing up, they also used to dabble in different ventures, all sorts of things, but I'm never one of those kind of guys. I never really had, it wasn't even a matter of trying and not doing well. It just never occurred to me as something I wanted to do. But then life happens and you kind of go through different things and your perspective changes and you see different things and you go to different places and you have various conversations. And I'm the kind of person, as I've matured in life and as I've grown older, I like to think my perspective and my confidence in myself. There's a saying I really like, the saying that ambition grows on you when your confidence grows. So when you become more confident in your own ability, your ambition tends to grow as well. So as I developed a lot more confidence in my own ability, I then decided I was going to take a risk on myself. They say if you don't buy the ticket, you don't win the lottery, right? So I just chose to go for it and just say, okay, you know what? At the point when I started Talking Drum, I'd been in the industry for over a decade and had the opportunity of working with some of the biggest technology companies in the world. So for me, I'd seen how these guys run their comms. I'd helped some of them lead and deliver award-winning campaigns. So for me, it was like, go for it. Right. So I went for it at that point, even though it wasn't a plan. And I can honestly say it's the best career decision I've ever made. I've grown even more since I made that decision because you're always learning every day. You're always challenging yourself. You're always having to navigate different conversations that you previously wouldn't have been part of, taking on new skills and just growing. I think the big thing I'm very happy with is the growth since day one. So if I compare the person speaking to you today with the person that I kind of remember on day one of Talking Drum, the level of maturity is completely different. Very different manner. I'm very thankful for how this experience has afforded me that.
So you've detailed how it was never your plan to start a PR company, but when you started your company, you'd been in the industry for over a decade. So you're probably quite aware in terms of, I was hoping you could probably detail in terms of how important do you believe effective publicity and perception shaping is for companies that are innovating in Africa?
Oh, it's so essential. It's probably, I'm obviously a bit biased, but I'll say it's up there with the most essential things that African companies need to focus on today. And the reason why I say that is because there seems to be an established global narrative about Africa. So again, a couple of steps back. So I mentioned earlier that my family relocated to the UK from Nigeria in the early 2000s. And one of my abiding memories from that time, or from the early days of living in the UK, was that when I opened my mouth and I said, I am from Nigeria, the default conversation that people wanted to have was about how tough life was and how bad poverty is on the continent and all those kind of typical conversations. And it wasn't like my family we're not like the Dangotes or anything, or we're not like filthy rich or anything, but we also weren't poor. So this idea of Africans being poor by default kind of threw me off a little bit but again, the reason why these people are asking these questions or were interested in having this conversation, because that was the perspective they had of Africans, because all the information they had consumed, all the stories that they had heard, and everything that was out there about Africa was stories of poverty, stories of deprivation, and all those other stories that are out there. So it became increasingly clear that when people were talking about doing stuff in Africa, their conversation was predominantly around charity and aid and that kind of stuff, where if you look at how other economies have grown across the world over time, it wasn't through charity or aid, it was through doing big business. But if you don't know or feel like business can be done in a specific place or with a specific people, then you wouldn't even consider doing it. So for African companies, I think is really essential, because changing the narrative, and it's a very sort of overstated thing. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of sense in that whole narrative. I get it, because I think there's an age-old narrative. It's a very tired narrative at the moment. Because one of the things that you also realize when you actually do a little bit of digging, I was doing some research into, I think McKinsey reported this. I think it was as far back as 2016. So this number's probably grown since then, but reported that there are like 500 companies in Africa that have over $1 billion in revenue every year. And if you drill a little bit below that, I think there's about 700 that have over $500 million in revenue every year. But the thing is, when you think about the perception of business in Africa, people don't typically think of African businesses in that context. People don't even think of African businesses at all. So I feel like there's a way we can tell these stories. And I believe public relations can be an effective tool for getting these stories out there and creating effective perceptions that will ultimately drive the economic growth that we want to see in Africa. Because it's not because we've had this conversation many, many times, and many people that have been on this podcast have had similar conversations as well. Like, it's not like we lack resources, but I think one of the components is not the silver bullet, and it's not the be all and end all, but one of the main components of driving economic growth is effective storytelling. We've seen it with pretty much anything that's achieved. If you look at all these companies, so I mentioned earlier about some of the large international companies that we worked with. I remember you going to for client meetings, you go into offices for like client meetings, and entire floors with like scores of people be dedicated to marketing, comms, like sometimes hundreds of people just working on this because these guys knew the value of putting themselves out in an effective light. But sometimes when you're talking to African companies, they have like one person, or sometimes you have like an intern.
Yes.
Like who's responsible for that. And it's like, again, I know I'm a bit biased because this is what I do, but at the same time, I'm like, there's a disconnect there, because if these large companies that are already successful are still investing this amount of resources into marketing and communications and public relations, then any company that's aiming to reach that level needs to start considering that level of investment into how they are perceived externally, and not just for the sake of perception, but as a tool rather, for driving the success that they want to achieve as a business. I don't know if that answers the question.
It definitely answered the question. So you've detailed about your personal experience and how PR comms and perceptions influenced your early experiences in the UK, and how you believe that effective PR and comms can contribute to driving economic growth on the continent. So if we look at that specifically, in what ways do you believe PR and communications can be leveraged as a tool to create economic growth?
Yeah, I think, like I said, yes, it's all about perception. If you think back to what the actual definition of public relations is, it's about sharing and managing information to shape a particular perspective. And I mentioned earlier about how if all you think about when it comes to Africa is charity and aid, then when you have a $100 billion, trillion dollar contract to give, Africa doesn't even cross your mind as even getting like a fraction of that, right? And a good example, let's look at the tech ecosystem in Africa, for example, the startup ecosystem. A few years ago, that ecosystem was barely attracting a couple of $100 million annually in terms of venture capital funding to drive growth in the ecosystem. And then something happened a few years ago when a company called Paystack was acquired by Stripe for $200 million. And what that did, and that story traveled very far, what that did is that signaled a lot of investors, both locally and internationally, that you can build a successful tech startup in Africa that's worth that amount of money, right? And on the back of that, the investment that came into the African tech ecosystem significantly spiraled. Again, one thing you probably realize as I go with this conversation, I'm a big fan of sayings as an African. I think the effect here is the thing of if a tree fell in the forest and no one was there to see it, did it make a sound?
Yes.
Right. So there are these things that are happening and no one's there to capture, no one's there to report it, no one's there. And beyond just reporting it, no one is there to tell the story in a way that works positively for us as Africans or for the business. And I didn't forget Africa as a whole. Let's talk about the business or the businesses that are involved in these things, which is where PR comes in. It's about looking at everything that's happening within a business or within an ecosystem and seeing how the stories, how the milestones, how the issues can be crafted in a way that work for the benefit of the business or the businesses or the ecosystem. So it's that thing of starting from where you want to end up. So what you're trying to achieve as a business, where do you want to end up, right? You start from there, you kind of work your way back, right, to where you are. So with the work we do with a lot of our clients, one of the first conversations we ask, or one of the first questions that we ask them, where do you want to be? What does success look like for you? And then we then shift the narrative around that, kind of working with them to tell a story that aligns. Because if you're trying to end up at point A, and your narrative is pointing at point B, then it's a waste of time. So just making sure that the narrative aligns with the goal, and also challenging them to have dream big dreams. Try to be the best version of yourself that you can be. Try to grow as effectively and because the success of the innovators that we work with and the continued success of these companies is shaping a drastic change in how Africans view themselves and in how people across the world view the continent.
With that in mind, considering the drastic changes and also looking at the diverse cultural and linguistic landscape of Africa, from your experience working within, say, European Western companies and working on the continent, are there any nuances or differences in how PR and comms is executed on the continent compared to outside of the continent?
That's an interesting question. So on a fundamental level, No, because what everyone's trying to achieve largely is the same thing. Like on a tactical level, yes, things are done differently because you're dealing with people with different sentiments and there's certain nuances. I like to think things move a lot quicker in Africa. One thing I noticed in the early days of my transition was that working with European sort of delivery partners and stuff, like sometimes you need like the delivery timelines were like 2 to 3 weeks where it will be a couple of days in Africa.
Yes.
So I think it's that. But also on the flip side, I think the Western media landscape is a little bit more developed. And what that means is, for example, if you have a company that focuses on cybersecurity or B2B, business-to-business payments, for example. So there's a company we're working with that does business-to-business payments across Africa. I don't think I'm aware of a specific publication that specifically covers B2B payments or accounting or finance specifically as a topic. At least when I used to work with UK companies, there's like a good number of people. So you had a little bit more flexibility in terms of the kind of stories you could tell. So if you're pushing like an accounting software, for example, there are countless accounting publications that they talk about accounting. If you talk about cybersecurity, there are countless cybersecurity focused publications that talk about cybersecurity. But in an African context, at this point in time, everything is just bundled under the quote unquote tech umbrella. So that means the depth you can go into sometimes isn't quite there, but it's a journey, right? So we're kind of going on that journey. There's a perception, which is largely inaccurate, that Africa is mainly pay for play, while Europe or the Western world is more sort of based on your storytelling, is based on the strength of your story rather than that. But I think my experience tells me different, because I remember working with UK-focused companies where we'd have to pay for sponsorship or where we had specific budgets for like wining and dining journalists. And those engagements typically led to more favorable coverage or stuff like that. Or you had events where you had goodie bags or stuff like that. It was just exactly, it's just different context, right? Where a lot of African journalists like ask for different things, and let's use UK journalists as an example. They ask for different things. And also there is no substituting PR for having a good story. If you have a good story, people will run it. That's just the heart of it. Yes. So like I said, going back to there's this misconception that there are significant differences, but the reality is that for the most part, it's more similar than different. But yes, there are the minor nuances that you have to understand and appreciate, because you're dealing with different cultures, different traditions, different levels of maturity in terms of the market, and also different considerations like that.
Yeah. So you mentioned on a tactical level, there are differences in how PR and communications is executed on the continent. So if we look at the strategic level, do you believe that you have to tailor PR and comm strategies to suit the unique needs and challenges of African innovators and companies operating on the continent?
Oh, yeah, to a large extent, yes. Again, the way we like to work at Talking Drum is, again, we start off by investing in understanding, first of all, what the client does and then what they're trying to achieve, right? And then we then go from there to the context they're trying to achieve it. So it's important, for example, to understand what success looks like in Kenya versus what success looks like in Nigeria, and then work towards that. Now, if those two things look exactly the same, yes, we'll go from there. But if those two manifestations of success are different, then we have to adapt the strategy to make sure that, again, because what we are focused on achieving is not just about execution, it's about success, right? So for me, so that's what really drives the work that we do. It's really about understanding what success actually looks like. So the real measure of success is not, again, like going back to the early days of PR, where the metric for success was how many press releases you distributed and how big your media list was. Yes, that's still very important, but I think it's more about the impact. So what results did the story that you put out there, what results did it generate? How did it impact the goals that the business is trying to achieve? So if a business is trying to get acquired, that's not going to happen because you put out 100 different press releases. You can put out one good press release. Also, it's not going to happen with one straight one. It's not a silver bullet kind of thing. So again, going back to the question, I think it all depends on what success looks like. So for us, we like to invest a lot in understanding what success looks like in particular contexts, and that then influences how we tailor our strategy. So again, because what that then means is when all said and done, we can measure it effectively and say, okay, this thing that we tried, did it work? As in, did it help us? Are we closer to achieving the goal we set out to achieve, or are we still where we were when we started? And I think that's probably how we like to look at it.
Thank you for that. So earlier you mentioned that one of the major differences was the amount of resource allocated to PR and comms, and often PR and comms is under-resourced in Africa or on the continent. So how do you believe the role of PR and comms in Africa has evolved over the past few decades? What factors do you believe have potentially contributed to that evolution or change?
So I think this is also another interesting question, because I think for me, like some kind of advantage I have is when my dad also used to work in public relations for one of the largest universities in Nigeria about 30 or so years ago. So from time to time, even though I have this I have a weird thing that I don't like talking shop and talking work with members of my family. But when me and dad sit down sometimes, he kind of tells me about how they used to run PR, and it was this sort of element of strategy in there, but it was more sort of tactical, that we need to do this, we need to do that. It was done very differently, right? Not to say there was no strategy. Clearly there was strategy, because the tenets of what PR is hasn't really changed significantly since as far back as anyone can remember. But I think in terms of how it changed between then and now, I think a significant change is the introduction of measurement. Because before, it was just you put something out there and you could just make up whatever you want to make up. Just say, oh, this is what it is and this is what we've achieved, and you can attribute whatever you can find to yourself. And if anything goes well, you say it's you. If something doesn't go well, you kind of hold your hand up and say, hey, that wasn't us. But over the last few years, with the advent of technology, it's easier to actually measure. And this whole conversation about measuring the impact of PR is a very interesting one that seems to be moving in also different directions over time, because I think that's a real thing. Because people, you invest a lot of resources into something, you want to know what you're getting. But PR is a slightly different thing. But anyway, what we're seeing more is we're seeing more technology platforms where you can measure the level of engagement with your articles. You can measure the level of how much people are sharing it. And also you can measure the impact of activity on perceptions or on interest in what you're doing as a company. Well, a good example that some people do from time to time is if you put out an announcement, or if you announce something, or you put a product out there on the market, you then go into like your analytics and you see a spike in Google searches, or you see a spike in inbound requests to your website. So, for example, something that we tend to see with a lot of companies that we work with in the startup space is a lot of them are trying to raise money. And when we put out press releases, or when we do interviews, or when we put out content around them, they see organic spikes in inbound requests from investors, partners, and those kind of things. So the ability to measure those things makes a huge difference, because you can tell it like before, if you're doing with traditional media, for example, in the pre-internet days, with traditional media, someone may not see like a newspaper article until God knows when. It's difficult to actually work out if they're calling you, unless they tell you that, oh, I saw this article and so I'm calling you. And even then, it's difficult to kind of measure that kind of thing. But now with the greater availability of technology, you're able to measure these things. And I think that's then made it easier for PR practitioners and people like myself to be more strategic and to advise businesses in a more strategic way that, okay, if you want to achieve this is what we've seen to work historically over the past, that kind of measurement piece.
Yes.
I think that's really changed how PR works. It's a very interesting conversation that's still evolving.
Yes, I agree. So you shared the interesting insight regarding your father working in PR. So looking back at that time, I don't want to assume his age, but say 30 to 40 years ago.
About right.
What were some of the most significant challenges for PR and comms in Africa? How do you believe they have transformed over time?
Interesting question. I would say, again, I'll go to the advent of technology as a tool. I think technology has really changed a lot. In that time, I think you were working with a limited number of potential platforms to work with. So from a media perspective, you had like a limited amount of TV stations, radio stations that you could work with. And there was nothing like online, no blogs, no YouTube, no podcasts, no different channels, no different formats. In terms of the formats you had to work with, the formats were very few and far between. So what that meant is you're very limited. You had very little room for maneuver. You either got it right in this space or that was it. But I think what we've seen now with the advent of the digital age is you have a lot more options to work with. You have a lot more opportunities. Again, for us at Talking Drum, one thing we do a lot more now is beyond TV, radio, online, blog, or whatever, looking at different sort of storytelling tactics. So again, video-led content, newsletters, blog pieces, blog posts, all sorts of different forms of content, right? But pre the digital age, a lot of those things were difficult, if not impossible, to explore because just wasn't as readily available as we have them today. And that's the thing when I talk to Dad about it. Dad always talks about how the internet and the ability to broadly share news has transformed communication significantly. It's a completely different ballgame, which means your stories can travel further. You can be a bit more targeted. And because you have like broader reach for your stories, you can then afford to craft specific stories and dig a little bit deeper rather than throwing like a wide net and hoping it catches as many people as possible. You, in many ways, fish with a hook.
Yes.
Right? Because you can target specific people. And I think the advent of the internet and technology more broadly has really made it much, much easier to do that than what it would have been like 30, 40 years ago.
So you've detailed in terms of the advance in technology and the ability to measure certain metrics and target people. So when targeting people and understanding what drives the engagements for people to be interested in African stories, do you believe there's more positive perception or narrative coming from non-African sources or outlets that are driving this?
I'll say no, because there's been a significant increase in the availability of specific journalists, reporters that cover business in Africa specifically. So that's significantly increased over the last like 5 to 10 years. Like there's no debate on that. And that means these guys and they're typically African people who typically share the same sentiments about trying to tell great stories about Africa. So you typically see these guys writing these kind of stories and covering them broadly. But at the same time, there's an experiment that I carried out a few years ago, and I like to sort of when I'm able to find time, I kind of carry out this test, and I go on the websites of some of the leading news platforms in the world, and I just type in Africa, and like 90% of the stories, if not more, are about war, famine, poverty, and all those kind of things. And what we then typically do is I will try and identify who the Africa reporter is. Sometimes they even have like regional reporters. Sometimes they have like country-specific reporters. Identify who they are, try to reach out to them, try to connect with them. Sometimes try to pitch them stories, try to pitch them ideas. And 9 times out of 10, these people don't typically respond, but they're out there publishing all sorts of negative stories about Africa, about war, famine, and poverty. Like that's the only thing happening, or that's the only thing worth reporting on the continent. Have we made progress in the last 5 to 10 years? Absolutely, but there's still a long way to go. For me, the future I want to see in terms of a global narrative about Africa is a future where the predominant narrative about Africa is about African innovation and ingenuity and business, and all this other stuff become peripheral, because I've lived in the UK long enough to know that Great Britain is a construct. It doesn't exist because everything is great and wonderful across the continent or across the country. That's not the reason. It's because somebody somewhere decided that they were going to work together and create a particular perception about the country that they believed worked for them. And they got the media to kind of buy into the idea. They got everyone to buy into the idea, and they're out there kind of projecting this image onto the world. When you think about it, it's called Great Britain.
Very true.
So, and then they're projecting this thing across the world to anyone that will listen and trying to do good for themselves. And I don't blame them. I think it's a fantastic idea. So I think from an African perspective, maybe it's a call to sort of diversify how we think of African media and take this more sort of, let's call it strategic. And there's a few platforms I imagine are doing this, and a lot of media platforms already do this. But it's a case of, I think we need to do more media platforms need to arise, more different kinds of content. We need to take it on ourselves to push these progressive narratives that will ultimately change the perception of Africa to one that can support effective business growth across the continent.
Fantastic. Very interesting insights you shared that, which I agree with in terms of how PR and comms has been utilized historically to push the narrative or story of Great Britain, something that I think a lot of African countries could take specific lessons from.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I guess if we move from countries to companies, Do you feel that African companies are starting to fully appreciate the power of PR and comms, both internally and externally?
Oh, yes, definitely. Definitely. And this conversation comes up a lot when I'm speaking to prospects and people who go on to become clients of Talking Drum, where they're like before, their understanding of what PR was to just something happened, let's put it out there so that it's out there. And they kind of put like a half-baked, not very well thought through press release out there that doesn't really do much. It's just out there because to them it's like, what you do when you do something, you put out a press release. But then I think what happened is people have seen how telling the story in an effective way can be really useful for driving growth, and it can be really useful for achieving the goals they want to achieve. So people have seen how, for example, again, using fundraising or product announcements, for example, how putting an effective product announcement out there can drive sales leads, how putting an effective product can attract partners and customers and all the different people that you want to engage with, rather than just putting something out there that doesn't really do anything for anyone. So yes, I think the more people are seeing these things, they are now sort of being more intentional. They're now engaging people like ourselves, trying to working with us to sort of craft their story in a more effective way. And again, going back to what I mentioned in the beginning about having conversations about where you're actually trying to end up. So before we do anything, the first thing we talk about is where exactly are you trying to end? So we make sure that everything that's coming out, be it a press release, which is an interview, be it a video-led piece, be it a podcast, but whatever it is, everything feeds ultimately into the overall business goal.
Fantastic. So you've detailed that African companies are starting to fully appreciate the power of PR to generate sales leads, engage customers. So if you look at it from the Talking Drum perspective, what are the advantages or value that your services bring? I think you've touched on some of them in terms of the sales leads and customers, but outside of that, what do you believe the value you bring in terms of the services that you deliver to your customers?
I'll say a key sort of value add that we offer our customers is clarity on what they do. So I feel, again, I mentioned earlier that a lot of the guys that we work with are very, very intelligent people who are building very innovative and useful, impactful products. But sometimes, when you have something that works, you understand it in your head, it makes sense in your head, it works, but it can sometimes be difficult to communicate it clearly. So there can often be a bit of confusion about what is this? How do I deliver this message? How do I communicate it in the most clear and effective way possible? So where we come in sometimes, in many cases actually, is helping them to distill this thing. So whether or not it's via an engagement or an opportunity that we set up, or they're just in front of like a potential partner, wherever they're trying to talk to, we help them to kind of condense their narrative, as it were, condense their value proposition in a way that it's clear and it makes perfect sense to their partners and the potential customers. So for us, I think that's a real value add, because you come in a point, most of the time we start this conversation where you ask them, so what exactly do you do? And the what do you do conversation, the answer to the question is like a 5-minute long speech about this, that, and the other. But after working with us for sometimes a couple of weeks, that then goes into like a short 50-word statement, right? That goes straight to the point, says exactly what it needs to say and communicates very clearly. And that's something you can carry with you. So if anyone ever asks you what you do, you're able to then communicate very clearly in a very succinct way. So beyond the leads, beyond the creating perceptions or whatever, is that clarity piece tends to be something that our clients always come back to us to say, thank you for doing this for us. Because like I said, a lot of times they have these things in their head, and where we come in sometimes is helping them pull it out. And we have processes that we work through. We sometimes run like messaging sessions where we spend like 2-3 hours sometimes just sitting down and helping them kind of tease out these things. And we then go away, do a lot of work to deconstruct it and put it together in a format that they could then take away and use or hand to members of the team and stuff like that. I would say that clarity piece is definitely something that our clients tend to come back with a positive feedback on.
Brilliant. So loud and clear, clarity is one of the key values that you add as Talking Drum communication. So when you're looking at the success or value that is added, how do you measure the success of a PR and communications campaign in African context?
Well, in any context, really. But I think, again, it goes back to what I mentioned at the beginning about what exactly are we trying to achieve? So I'll give you an example with when we do funded announcements for our clients, 9 times out of 10, those funding rounds would have been closed a couple of weeks or a couple of months in some cases before we make the announcement.
Yes.
And when those announcements then go out, there tends to be a primary objective that the business is trying to accomplish at the time. So one business that we work with, their objective was they were trying to grow particular teams within the business. So an objective that we leveraged the press release to fulfill was to attract inbound job applications to the company. For another client, they wanted to raise money. So they wanted to announce money so that they can raise more money. And that company has successfully raised multiple rounds after we announced their raise. For another business, it's about they wanted to sort of strike partnerships, a specific profile of company, they targeted partnership with a specific sector. We help them craft narratives that made them attractive to that sector. So when it's all said and done, the real measure of the effectiveness of the work that we did was around how they achieved those goals. So for us, that's the real measure, right? So again, it's not just about putting press releases for the sake of putting press releases out, or doing interviews for the sake of doing interviews, or doing it for the sake of doing it. Everything is always attached to a specific business goal that we can then track. So, and again, some business goals take 6 months to deliver. Some will take a couple of weeks. Some will take like a year. So we then have to be honest about the timelines on that. So we know how to measure it effectively, because if something takes 6 months to come through and we're trying to get all the results in by a week in, then it's going to look like what we did didn't really work, where we just need to be honest and say, look, this thing typically takes X amount of time. Now, if it gets done a bit quicker, then fine. But again, going back to the point, it all depends on what we're setting out to achieve. Once we have clarity on that, then we can then talk about how do we communicate, how do we share information, how do we manage information in a way that shapes a particular perception that helps our clients achieve whatever business goal they want to achieve. So that's how we then measure it, and that tends to work very well for us.
Brilliant. So you've detailed what success looks like for a range of your clients. So if you look at the clients and companies, are there any specific sectors that you're seeing a high amount of interest with regards to engaging PR and comms?
So for financial services, it's the biggest one. Those guys typically attract the highest amount of funding across the continent. So it makes sense that they have the budgets, and there are more companies in that space as well. So we tend to attract a lot more financial services companies. So from payment companies, consumer payments, B2B payments. But at the same time, we see a lot of e-commerce companies as well. So that's another sector. So from food e-commerce to B2B e-commerce to fashion e-commerce, and then people that provide solutions into those kind of spaces as well. So fintech and e-commerce are typically the two that we attract the most attention for. But then stuff like agri-tech is also very common as well. We've done a lot of work with companies that operated in and around the agricultural space, because agriculture is definitely one of the largest, if not the largest employer on the continent.
Yes.
So it makes sense that a lot of people are involved in that business, and people trying to shape perceptions. That I'm a big fan of agriculture as a topic anyway, for many reasons. My uncle used to work at IITA, the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture in Ibadan city that we grew up in. So I spent a lot of my childhood going with him, exploring. He was studying, I forget what he was studying, something to do with insects and stuff. And then my brother also was interested in agriculture when he was younger as well. So for many different reasons, I have a strong interest in agriculture and that kind of sector. So yeah, but in terms of where we tend to attract a lot of our clients from, it tends to be financial services and sort of e-commerce. But broadly speaking, we worked with pretty much every sector that you can mention. Like I said, we've done this around fashion tech, and there were a whole bunch of different stuff as well.
Brilliant. So you're seeing a trend of financial services and agriculture companies engaging PR and comms. So sticking on the theme, I guess, of trends, and we're seeing the business landscape in Africa continue to evolve. What emerging trends are you seeing in PR and comms on the continent that you're currently excited about?
Two things. The first one is artificial intelligence.
Okay.
I think artificial intelligence is going to be a big game changer for how public relations is done on the continent. And the reason why I say that is because what artificial intelligence does is it takes over a lot of the mundane, repetitive stuff that doesn't maximize the potential of the human mind. So it kind of takes over that. It then frees up human beings to do what they are best at. And for us at Token Drum, one of the things I'm really looking into doing is upskilling the team so that a lot of the low end, those kind of mundane, repetitive stuff can be handled by some form of artificial intelligence. And that's something we're really trying to do. So again, we're trying to either upskill our existing team so that what we have is a team of highly capable, highly efficient, sort of really intelligent people that can deliver work to a very high standard. And we're maximizing their sort of the intellectual capacity. Because a big part of PR is PR. I mean, people think PR is just putting out press releases and stuff, but there's a lot of stuff to do with like admin and measurements and sort of recording and reviewing and a lot of these things that human beings can do. But because human beings are prone to error, we are not best suited to doing a lot of these things. So if we can bring in a layer of artificial intelligence there, artificial intelligence covers a lot of that. So what we then focus on is maximizing the intelligence of the people that we have on the team and make sure that people are working to their full potential and actually utilizing their intellectual capacity. For now, it's still a work in progress. So stuff like ChatGPT, we're kind of exploring how we can use that within the business. There's something I'm excited to see, like Microsoft is unveiling something called Copilot very soon. I think they've announced it, but I'm still waiting for it to be rolled out, stuff like that.
Yes.
Looking at how we can leverage that so that, again, from a workload perspective, the things that machines can't do, like machines can't think the way human beings think. Machines can't multitask the way, like at least not now. So thinking about how AI will sort of take those mundane bottom layer things and then the human beings can take more serious stuff on.
It's great that you're embracing AI and you don't see it as a threat, as AI is the future. So if you look at the future, where do you see Africa in 5 years' time from the perspective of embracing and leveraging PR and comms to its advantage?
I believe very strongly that if we achieve what we're trying to achieve at Talking Drum in the next 5 to 10 years, we will have a significantly different narrative about Africa, which will be a catalyst for all sorts of economic growth on the continent. So again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to tell stories in all sorts of different ways about innovation and the impact of innovation on the continent. So for us, what we are hoping to achieve with that, again, going back to this whole formula of what we're trying to achieve and kind of working our way backwards from there, it's about what we're trying to achieve is to have a economically prosperous continent. And we believe very strongly that a strong narrative about innovation, a strong innovation narrative can be a catalyst for that. If we're able to consistently do what we've been doing over the last couple of years that we've been around, we believe like in the next 5 to 10 years from now. And again, just for context as well, in terms of one of the main reasons why I do this is I envision a world in the future that if my children travel to wherever corner of the world, like I had to travel from Nigeria to come and live in the UK, when they open their mouths and they say, I am from Nigeria or I'm from wherever, that the predominant conversation will be a conversation about African innovation rather than all the other stuff. So that's a big driver on a personal level for this thing that I'm trying to achieve. So,
Brilliant.
So I think 5 to 10 years from now, I hope it will be a very different conversation we're having about the perspective around Africa.
Fantastic. So I guess looking closer to home, where do you see yourself in Talking Drums? I know you've slightly touched on it, but where do you see yourself in Talking Drums specifically in 5 years' time?
Well, we're telling bigger stories, trying to grow the business, trying to deliver a wide range of services as well. So at the moment, we largely focus on the PR side, but thinking about other services that complement PR that we can deliver in the near future. I think that's something that we're looking at growth, doing more big stories for big clients. I have a few companies that I would not name, a few target companies I have in mind that I would love them to be Talking Drum clients in the near future. But beyond that, I think it's just growing the business to deliver a wide range of services that I believe will complement what we're already doing and help us on this mission of taking African innovation stories to the world and ultimately shaping a more beneficial perspective of Africa, both locally and globally.
Brilliant, brilliant. Looking forward to seeing that happen.
Thank you very much.
Quote of the week.
One question that I ask each guest is a bit different to the rest. I'm sure you'll be more than prepared for this one. As people, we often have quotes, mantras, African proverbs, or affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
Oh, I'll do better. I have two, actually. If you don't mind, if you can indulge me, I have two. So the first one is hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard.
Yes.
And that's just like a reminder in terms of like, there's no substitute for hard work. I'm a big believer in hard work. You can have all the talent in the world, but if you're not working hard, you're not going to reach your full potential. So that's like a constant reminder for me to never stop working hard.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, and the other one is impossible is not a fact, it's an opinion, which is, again, another mantra. Because, again, most times when I tell people what we're trying to achieve, a lot of people kind of roll their eyes and say, yeah, whatever, people have said this before. Like, okay, cool, that's your opinion. And you're entitled to your opinion, but I have a very different opinion. And people kind of say it's impossible and say all sorts of different things. So, we can go into the meaning of what that means. But yeah, for me, it's these two sayings: hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard, and impossible is not a fact, it's an opinion. Those two sayings are sayings I live by.
Brilliant. And one thing which I like about those two, they are two quotes that we've not had on the podcast so far.
Excellent.
Brilliant.
Excellent.
So, as we're coming to the end of today's conversation, I was wondering, do you have any closing remarks, any final calls to action for people who are interested in the work that you're doing at Talking Drum, or just interested in PRing comms in Africa?
Oh, so I put a shameless plug out there. If anyone's out there, reach out to us, give us a shout. But also, on a broader note, I think I'm a big believer in the potential of Africa. It's said often in a very sort of generic way, but I believe very strongly that Africa is the future. Like, this is our time, this is our century. I believe that by the end of the century, the conversation will be very different. And not only by the end of the century, in the next couple of decades, the conversation around Africa will be different. Some of those seeds are already beginning to take shape. And I believe very strongly in the promise of what Africa is and what it can become. And I'm just hoping to be able to play a small part in the fulfillment of what is possible.
Brilliant. And what a note to end today's conversation. Thank you so much, Bemi, for sharing your valuable insights and expertise on how PRing comms can drive economic growth and shape perceptions for African innovators. I think your journey and experience have been truly inspiring. And until next time, keep innovating, making a positive impact in Africa and beyond. Thank you for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Cheers.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.